yesterday, and a reminder there that the meeting's being recorded. Yeah, I thought it'd be nice to start with some Scotch mist, but yesterday it's looking brighter here. Just a very quick recap from yesterday, and then we'll move on to Graham Parton from STFC, who's going to give us a talk about the need to connect data stewardship roles across the research lifecycle and ecosystem. And then moving to Miriam, who's going to talk about setting up the data steward team at University of Ghent in their context. But the emphasis today is on more discussion to pick up on where we left yesterday. So a bit less time on presentation, more on that. And then we'll, towards the end of the morning, we'll hear from Helen Clare from JISC on a couple of UK initiatives that hopefully can help us move forward. So if you remember, yesterday we started off with an icebreaker, and we asked about what people's roles currently are and what people would like in their job titles. And it was interesting that more of us would like to have data steward in their job title than currently, or at least to develop that role in others if we don't have it ourselves. And we heard from Mike Yetten from Dutch Tech Centre for Life Sciences on the great work that's been being done in the Dutch National Platform for Open Science and other work that DTL have led to identify competencies for data stewards and job descriptions, role descriptions, and to look at three aspects of the data steward role, whether it's policy related or about infrastructure, or more focusing on the research disciplines. And we heard a couple of great examples from one from Lisa Otti from the Centre for Data Culture and Society in Edinburgh on their work to support people in the humanities and social sciences, and then Paul van Schaik from University of Maastricht on his work to really complement research software engineering role and get involved in developing new tools to support life scientists there. And we had some discussion on how people are already building in offers from external sources in the support that they're offering with data stewardship. And I think three things struck out for me, and we do a lot of amplification of existing data sources, training sources, services, and at the end of the research life cycle to try and promote the database research that people are doing. But I think we're also in data stewardship roles doing a lot of kind of noise reduction in a way, filtering the great diversity of needs and potential solutions that we can offer people. And underlying that is the pressure on costs, the number of researchers that we're expected to support. And to make that happen, there's a lot of connecting going on, and we heard mention of the coordinating groups that people rely on to connect up with others in the institution and elsewhere. And it certainly came up in one of the discussion groups. Maybe the emphasis on reward and recognition for open research is maybe a driver for institutions to give us a bit more resource on to support this work. So I won't take up more time looking backwards. Looking to today, we have the shared notes to refer to for anyone that's joining who wasn't here yesterday. The links I hope we can put in the chat, but they're in the joining instructions that you should have. The slides will be shared, and don't forget the Twitter handle if you'd like to mention anything from today. And we do have a break on the schedule at 10:50. Maybe not for beer. I couldn't find an icon for coffee, but there you go. Whatever refreshes you at 10:50 BST, 10 to 12 Europe. That's when we'll have a short break. Then more discussion, and I'll see you again at the end of the morning. So just for now, I'll hand over to Patricia, who's going to introduce our first speakers.
Yeah, thank you, Angus, for that little recap of yesterday's session. And we're kicking off this morning with Graham Parton. And Graham joined the UK's Centre for Environmental Data Analysis in 2007, where he has responsibility for observational data, which includes radar data and other things that I just realized I can't actually properly pronounce, from the atmospheric science community, drawing on his skills and knowledge gained in his atmospheric physics PhD. As a senior environmental data scientist, he also has responsibilities for CEDA's data catalog, and he is also an active member of the RDA interest group on professionalizing data stewardship, especially in the task group on models of data stewardship. And with that introduction, I hand over to Graham to kick us off today. Good morning. Questions in the chat, or in the notes, and we'll pick those up.
Right, I'm going to try and share my screen and hopefully get this presentation on the way. So, bear with me a second. Ooh. That's a good start. I've lost my presentation. There it is. And can you see that okay?
Wonderful.
Brilliant. So yeah, thanks very much for the time to sort of talk today. There's a lot to get through, so I'll try and be brief where I can be, and try and get through it all. So I was asked to sort of give a sort of talk on the need to connect data stewardship roles across the research life cycle and the ecosystem, which both with the research life cycle and ecosystem is a large topic. But I'm going to be taking this from a viewpoint of a domain repository, and hopefully that will kind of give some insight of my viewpoint and some hopeful insights of what could be done elsewhere as well. Before I go on, I just want to acknowledge a few colleagues, especially those people who've helped to provide some slides for today's talk. People like Jana and Robin, my colleagues across at CEDA and the NCAS Data Projects colleagues as well, especially Barbara Brooks, and also members of the modelling group in the PDS interest group, especially Nicholas, Bill, Angus, Lisa, and Adam. So before I go any further, I just want to really take a broad view and kind of look at the ecosystem as a whole, because that sort of touches on to the work done by the Professionalising Data Stewardship interest group, and in particular the organisational models task group. At the last RDA plenary, we actually had a session where we were looking at the modelling side of things, and we actually had a breakout session to bring people around sort of the problem which we're looking at, which is that data stewardship comes in many different forms and contexts with the common goal of supporting data management. But it's the sheer diversity of the activities, the roles, the environments that can make it hard for the research data community to further professionalize our work and services. And to sort of help with this problem, we're looking ultimately to produce some data stewardship models, which can hopefully then be used by the community to professionalize their own situations and to further develop them. And to start off with that, we're going to do an environmental scan of the various different approaches which are used. But underpinning all of our approach to this, the discussion is being sort of helped by a sort of conceptual diagram, which looks at the various parts of the roles of a data stewardship within a service as it provides functions and the resources that it needs to then serve the particular stakeholders, and also respecting that there are various standards and drivers which feed into that, and that there will be a given context around that service as well. And all of those aspects are important to sort of capture. But if we then take another sort of step back, and we can have a look at two sort of axes for the whole of the landscape, as it were, then we can look at two, which are how specific the repository or service might be with regards to its subject matter, whether it's generic or it's very specific or it's multidimensional. And then we can look at the size of the organization which it's found in as well, whether it's at project level all the way through to institutional, national, multinational, and global. And just as part of the work of the group, we just sort of thought, okay, does that work? Can we see particular exemplars of this area? And we certainly do find certain areas. For example, we've got the institutional-wide repositories, which we heard about a bit yesterday, where the data scientist or data steward might have a very broad role, possibly if they're overstretched, and there's varying levels of interaction. We're also aware that there are small-scale bespoke services, very much project-focused, where there's a real chance for the data steward to be really involved with what's going on, but also not so much so, and it could be a bit of a wild west of what actually happens to the data at the end of the project. There are pan-national data projects which can be very specific to given topics. So, for example, the Earth System Grid Federation looks after lots of environmental modeling data, and that kind of covers many different modeling centers around the world, but it's very technically heavy and has a very narrow scope. But slightly converse to that is that you get the pan-national generic services, where there might be a light touch technical solution for the end user, but the stewardship is very much left to the provider. And there's this little middle ground as well, which is the national domain repositories, which potentially are well resourced, but can have a fairly narrow focus. And that's really where I'm going to be sort of going down in the talk a bit later on. Now, the RDA plenary session, we actually have 5 talks to kind of go across that landscape. And if you want to have a look at the slides, they're available at the Liberty URL that's down there. But although there's a diversity of circumstances, there were success stories in there, which was great to hear. But there were also many common challenges about the staff that you need to kind of provide the services and how you sort of skill them and actually get staff in the first place. The resources which you need to then provide those services, and the scale of the task can be quite overwhelming as well, as I think we heard a fair bit yesterday. But also a common problem, which certainly I've come across as well, is getting researchers to actually engage with the data management process. Part of the work that the modelling group is actually doing is going to be rolling out a survey, hopefully soon, and that's going to have 3 basic areas. The first one's going to be about basic information about the service, the data provision. And then there's going to be information about the data stewardship roles, the functions, and the context. And then they'll be capturing the sort of the wider context as well. And also looking at various other aspects like the maturity of the service, how engaged it is with the community, the experiences that they've had, and also the impact that they've been able to give to the community. So that's the sort of general wide picture. Now I want to sort of look at kind of the research life cycle. And again, I want to sort of focus on my particular viewpoint, which is the domain repository, and in particular kind of the Environmental Data Service, EDS, which comes from the Natural Environment Research Council here in the UK. And that brings together 5 archives which cover different parts of the natural domain, natural sciences domain. And in particular, I'm then going to look at the INCAS data project as a particular exemplar about how the different roles of data stewardship can all interact. So first of all, what is the NERC Environmental Data Service? As I mentioned, it's a combination of 5 domain archives which have been brought together underneath one common service. That was commissioned by NERC a couple of years ago, and it's looking at developing common workflows, tools, and services. We have a large data store which complements the individual data stores for the different data centers. There are data analysis systems such as Jasmine, which complement that as well, and also cloud-based data labs. We have central data catalog as well to help the discovery of data, and to also give us a mechanism to actually review the quality of the metadata inside the catalogs. We have a shared stakeholder engagement process which we engage in to try and feed into the next round of commissioning for the service as well. And we have forums where we'll be able to sort of share experiences between the different data centers as we sort of bring together our past experiences to find common grounds of working. And it's very much about the common data management tracking tools, the workflows and reporting as well. But underpinning all of this is actually the NERC data policy, and the EDS is a way of sort of delivering that sort of policy. And NERC's data policy really sort of holds 2 aspects in balance. The first one is the researcher's right to use the data first of all, and the second one is then getting the data out into the public sphere, because the data are produced using money from the public purse ultimately. And to sort of address that, NERC data policy says, okay, we'll give the researchers right to first use for 2 years, but after that, the data needs to be properly curated in an open sense. And for that, it's looking at the data centers run by the EDS. The NERC data policy has a sort of long history as well. I think it starts around about 1996. Jana might be able to sort of correct me on that one. But it's the first time we sort of see that NERC sets out its policy and it recognizes the value of the data assets that's been produced from its funded research and the need to ensure the long-term preservation. And you see the requirements that projects produce data management plans. 14 years later, there was then a major revision of the NERC data policy. The grant proposals now need an outline data management plan. So this is not just waiting for the project to be funded before thinking about the data management, but also getting it in at the early stages. And again, it's the sort of stipulation that data must be publicly available within 2 years, as well as supporting that scientist's right to first use. The policy then gets published in 2011 and then starts to go through the implementation phase. And as part of that, there is tooling which NERC comes up with the data centers, and that centers around a system called DataMad, which gives the ability to track the progress of data delivery associated with grants within NERC. And that gives it increased reporting capabilities. And since then, there's been lots more sort of implementation and evolutions of that system. And we've just rolled out a new DataMad tracking system. And also the EDS uses JIRA to actually provide an additional level of tracking the individual actions that need to happen for each data management activity. So one of the key things I just want to point out there is that a take-home message from this talk should be relationships take time, and the relationships are important to build up. So hopefully that'll be a bit more evidence as well later on when I look at the NCAS data project. So with regards to the data lifecycle and the roles, I want to look particularly at the grants. And I think a very common sort of lifecycle that people are used to seeing is one from research lifecycle at the University of Central Florida. And you see the sort of planning cycle, and there's lots of activity that goes on there, through to a project cycle and a publication cycle, which can be linked up with a digital scholarship cycle. Now I'm going to sort of use that basic concept and roll it over into a NERC context. And I've introduced a grant application part of this as well. So at the very early stages in the planning cycle, the interaction that we have from, say, the facilities and the data scientists might be quite a loose one, but there may be interaction from the project members to come to the archives to see if there's any particular resources they can draw on to help their sort of scoping. There may have been past training which may have influenced the project members during this planning cycle as well. And I know that, for example, Jana, through the Geosciences Data Center, has done a lot of training with PhD students, which sort of feed into that process. And there's a good exemplar for that. And moving on from there, when it actually comes to the grant application, it's required for the PI will submit an outline data management plan. And it's through that they will also have interactions with the facilities, which they may need to draw on to see if there's any specific data storage requirements which come out of that. Assuming that it's funded, then there's a system which kicks in, the DataMad system I mentioned earlier, which allows the funder to then start to track the progress of the data management side of things associated with the data grant. And it then comes down to the NERC EDS service to then determine which data center is going to pick it up and run with that particular project to provide data management support. And part of that is the EDS tracking system that I mentioned earlier. Within the first 3 to 6 months, there's then a requirement from NERC that the outline data management plan is then evolved into a formal data management plan. And to feed into that, we have the NERC data value checklist, which gives a really nice sort of structured approach to take the project scientists through an assessment process on determining what research outputs from the data side of things will be worthwhile looking at for a long-term archive. And again, that's sort of tracked through the NERC DataMad system, and there will be a check back and reporting back to NERC to make sure that that is in progress. During the projects, then there will be various levels of interaction between an assigned data scientist from the data center and the project members, and we may see an evolution of that data management plan into various versions as things become clearer or circumstances change as well. And again, we sort of use the tracking system to help with that. And then as we move through to data products starting to become available, then it's very much the onus on the PI to ensure that a designated data provider, usually maybe a postdoc that's working within the project, works closely with the data scientist to prepare the data, ensure the metadata is of a sufficient quality provided as well, and again, supporting documentation is provided. They will undergo certain checks before they're then allowed into the archive, and the conversations can be quite intense at this time, especially when there are sort of deadlines looming. Part of this process will undoubtedly sort of connect through to the publication process as well, especially when you have sort of journals coming along and the data provider is working with the other project participants and wanting to get a paper out. I think it's been a sort of great change in the community that's with the requirements of journals saying we need your data to be properly archived in a suitable repository with a DOI, that we are seeing much greater willingness from the data providers to interact with us. But that's kind of like the perfect sort of system, and it was hopefully a demonstration that there's an end-to-end workflow, and there's conversations where there's interaction between the various different parties involved with the data lifecycle. But there is still not a perfect situation, and there are questions about how much visibility is there from the archive perspective of what goes on up the line, and therefore how much can we provide support as well. One of the first things that we kind of miss out on is any conversation which may go on between the facility and the data provider. And that can mean that there might be crucial bits of metadata missed out, and even data themselves as well. And we can find that the conversations with even the data provider can go mysteriously quiet at times. You know, research lifecycle moves on, and people are chasing the next grant. And you know, they may have done the paper and want to move on. And people, unfortunately, move on to other institutions as well. But because we've got that NERC data MAD system and our tracking tools, there is actually recourse that we can actually feed back to the funder and say, these people haven't provided what they ought to have provided. And there could be sanctions which kind of go down the line. And as soon as you start raising that prospect, alongside what the journals are saying, say you need your data in a recognized repository, DOIs, we suddenly find data providers come back very quickly, and the data magically appear with good quality metadata and documentation. So it's really good how there is, as well as carrots, there are also sticks in the system as well. But there still remain challenges. The project archives can also provide data elsewhere, and that can kind of cause some head scratching at times, where there's not a realization on the data providers that actually it's NERC policy that a proper copy of the data is also lodged within one of the NERC designated data centers. And some of that can come from external influences and involvement with external projects, and there could be conflicting demands there, which is understandable. People have only got so much limited time. But again, you know, it's a conversation which we can be involved with. It can help people to overcome those barriers. Researchers, as I mentioned earlier on, are chasing the next grant, so they're already moving on to the next task before they've completed this one. And sometimes that means that if you're not in early enough and you have late engagements, there can be important bits of metadata which are missed out on. There's also familiar reluctance still to let go of the data into the archive. And you know, it's about the fear that researchers have that they can be pipped to the post on the publication. But again, if we engage with the community, we build that trust and understanding, then we can hopefully assuage a lot of those fears and encourage people to provide their data, ensure that it's archived properly, backed up, so it's secure, but also their name is given on citations of the data. And we can provide embargo periods as well in line with the NERC data policy. Occasionally from an archive, we can also have data dropped on us from unresourced sources. And we have to sort of think about how we can meet those needs, because part of what we might want to do is to serve the wider community. And that can also involve sourcing third-party data, where our ability to kind of influence the data providers in terms of the data formats, the metadata, documentation is somewhat reduced because we're very much working on goodwill there. So the grant award workflow works well, but it's less so how well it works outside the traditional routes, and in particular at times with regards to some facility related data. Now, I want to point out with a lot of NERC facilities, they're really good at providing data, but there have been some stories in the past which have been not so good. But one particular example I'd like to look at is the NCAS data project, which is an end-to-end sort of data practice. It started off in 2016 with a meeting between our archive, CEDA, and my colleagues across in one of the NERC's National Centres for Atmospheric Sciences, NCAS, and their observations group, who have a responsibility for providing instrumentation for campaigns and also for long-term national capability measurements as well. And there was a real desire there from the community to find better solutions for the following challenges. first of all, the lack of data reusability, and then the lack of data visibility. So the wider community was saying it was hard to make use of the NCAS data products, while the data visibility came very much from the data providers saying, well, it's great, we've put the data into your archive, but users are finding it very hard to locate it and to understand it. Part of this was also there was a variation of data provider practices and skills, and the providers were finding it increasingly hard to manage the data volumes and the rates of data that were flowing as well. And so they needed suitable workflows and systems to be able to manage that. And so we had a collaboration project, and it's still an ongoing project, working with the instrument scientists, the IT specialists, and the data scientists. So
2 minutes, Graham.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, that's very quickly about AIMOF. The philosophy really centers around about kind of the end users and making sure that they are part of the conversation as well, that we are providing systems, tools, and standards which meet the end user's needs. And it is a constant conversation. And there's a great degree of connectivity between all of those components with regards to data production, the data flows, the data quality, I can't read this, so my things in the way at the moment. Oop, data access, there we go. And data usage as well. And those are all really important, crucial conversations that happen throughout this process. And it's an iterative process as well. So that as we move on and produce the data with quality and certain standards, it's meeting the end user needs in regards to the data feeds into the tools which they use as well. The overall progress and the outputs are that we have various data standards which are sort of evolving. Our main one, which is the NCAS General Standards, is in its version 3 now. Our earlier ones are, other ones, the NCAS Image and Radar, are moving through to version 1 later this year, and the NCAS Airborne is still in an early draft. We have controlled vocabularies around that, compliance checking suites for the data as they come in against those standards. And we have dedicated group workspace to handle the large amounts of data flow. And a formalized approach to sort of documenting the whole process with version controlled documentation, which can then be cited actually within the data itself to link it all together. And we've been able to get funding for a dedicated facility data scientist to aid with the workflows and visualizations. So I just want to, that's kind of a particular exemplar, and I want to sort of go back out to kind of the ecosystem perspective and really sort of raise some questions maybe for discussion a bit later on about the different areas we can look at, but maybe kind of the projects, whether there's questions about longevity and interoperability, about funding sustainability, the flexibility, the sustainability, visibility, relevance for institutional size repositories and also for the global repositories, and whether or not they failed fund requirements, and what the roles are for data scientists and research data management experts, funders and journals within those areas. And where do researchers go to sort of find the answer to these questions, where there's many different conflicting demands and different directions where they should go to. Is it funder guidance, national policy, journal requirements, project requirements, especially if there's international involvement, and other drivers, for example, the networks and colleagues and how they can influence where researchers go, legal requirements as well. And it certainly can lead to questions for data scientists and research data management experts to help with those questions as well. And one of them is, what sort of repositories to recommend? I think was a question which can, sort of raised yesterday. Funders can mandate repositories. There are lists like Re3 Data and Fair Sharing. Journalists are sort of coming around, which also have recommended repositories. Networks and colleagues can sort of also give recommendations. But I think, with the emergence of things like the Core Trust Seal and other similar sort of schemes to signify quality of repositories as well, hopefully that will allow some of the signals of good quality repositories and services to stand out above the crowd around it. So there we go. That's a very quick whistle-stop tour. Any questions?
Thank you, Graham. That was impressive, and I think I nodded along to quite a lot of the things you said. And just like I'm amazed again. I don't think I was aware of how long the NERC policy has already been been around. So yeah, I'm not the most patient person, and this is a good reminder that these things indeed do need time. Angus has popped one question in the chat so far, and it's probably a quick one to answer, so we can do that one before we move on. And then if people want to add more questions to the chat or just keep your thoughts for the discussion, that's fine as well. So yeah, Angus is wondering if the data value checklist that you provide is also made available to institutional data support folks, and if you're aware that any of them are using them or more widely or in their preparation with researchers.
So it's freely available on the NERC website. There's a link in some supplementary slides I've got on my talk as well, through to the data value checklist. In fact, somebody's just posted up. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
And it's there. Make good use of it. And feel free to sort of come to the data centers and ask questions if you want to. Personally, I've used it mainly when supporting grants and the conversations with the data management plans, and with also some of our non-NERC data suppliers as well, which have approached us. And it can help us within a data center when we are approached by those non-NERC providers or potential providers to assess whether or not we should actually be the data center to provide support. That's not always the case.
Yeah, and now more questions are going in, but we're out of time for our initial slot. So I hope we can pick some of them up later on. I don't know, Graham, if you have some time to read through, you can maybe also start asking, answering in writing. Yeah, how well you track things through Jira is like, I'm very interested to hear how that works, because that's like an interesting use indeed. Okay. But for the moment, thank you very much, Graham, for that like really good, quick overview. And we're moving on to our second speaker for this moment, morning, which is Miriam Martins, who has recently taken up a position as Open Science Coordinator at Ghent University Library. In this capacity, she also leads a team of data stewards that she set up in 2019 after joining the library as a research data officer in 2015. Before that, she worked as an associate research fellow at the University of Exeter, where she helped develop data management guidelines and support for a research group. And Miriam holds a PhD in history from Ghent University. So good morning, Miriam, and the floor is yours if you can kick off your slides.
Thanks, Patricia. Let me see if I can pull up the slides. Okay, so does that look all right?
Wonderful.
Okay, thanks. Good morning, everyone, and thanks a lot for inviting me to talk to you today a little bit about our experiences at Ghent University with setting up a data steward team and how that fits into some developments taking place at the national and regional level in Belgium. So our data steward team was set up fairly recently, back in October 2019. It's a small team of dedicated data stewards who have the explicit mission to promote and facilitate good data management practices within our research community, and also to contribute to advancing cultural change towards more fair data, more open data, and also more data reuse. So why did we felt we needed to set up a team of data stewards? Well, first of all, as I'm sure you're all very much aware, because supporting good data management not only requires technical infrastructure, it also requires the human infrastructure. Secondly, because we wanted to professionalize our support for data management, so we really wanted to have people dedicated to do this job and not some people taking this on in addition to many other jobs that they were doing. So we really wanted to professionalize this and also be able to offer support that was a bit more tailored to the different disciplines within our institution. So before we had the team, it was just me. And of course, I have a background in history, and it can be more difficult to relate to disciplines that are far removed from that. We also wanted to have a team that was coordinated and that was working closely together, rather than have individuals working from different locations in isolation, because we wanted to be able to ensure consistent messages across our institution, and also to facilitate the exchange of information between those people. I'm sure you all know that universities are quite big and complex organizations where a lot of things are happening. So we felt that, you know, being able to properly exchange information with all the data support staff was crucial. So how did we go about setting up this team? On the slide, you can see the sort of 4 steps that we went through. First of all, of course, we had to convince university management to hire data stewards. Then we also thought a little bit about how to implement data stewardship within the specific context of our institution. Then, of course, we had to actually recruit the people and finally get started as a team.
Miriam, I think your slide stopped moving somehow. We're still stuck on slide 3.
Sorry about that.
I don't know if that is just a hiccup in Zoom. We've done so well so far.
So any changes?
Not on my end. Can anyone else see the slides advancing?
No, just
No. Maybe you need to like reshare again. Sorry.
Yeah, I'll try again. Stop sharing and try again. Sorry about that.
Well, not your fault. This is just like technology stopping working, stopping to work somehow. Worst case, you've shared the link already. So, you know, if this like doesn't work out, people will need to follow along or can follow along on.
So what slide can you see now?
At the moment, it's still loading for me. I don't know if anyone else can see.
No, it's, oh, yeah.
Yeah, now it kicked in again.
Okay. I'm getting some strange feedback because according to Zoom on my computer, I'm sharing, but.
We're back on slide 4.
Back on slide 4.
Wonderful, okay. Sorry.
No problem. Can you now see the next slide?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So as I was saying, as a first step, of course, we had to convince our university management to hire data stewards. And so to get this buy-in, we pointed out a couple of factors, and in fact, we were successfully because they agreed to fund data steward positions. And so, first of all, we referred to the changing legal and policy landscape around research data. You know, things like the GDPR, but of course also data sharing requirements from funders, publishers, and so on. In addition, we also referred to an existing knowledge and skills gap among our researchers. And that is something that we actually demonstrated by contributing to a study that was done a few years previously by an inter-university working group on RDM, of which I'm also a member. So there we really did a survey and demonstrated that there was quite a big knowledge and skills gap. What was also really useful is that we were able to point to emerging data stewardship programs elsewhere, especially in the Netherlands. So where you had this new kind of data professional emerging, that was really useful. And then last but not least, what also helped was that we were able to point to expectations that our Flemish government was considering providing funds to support open science. So they had also been given the report on the knowledge and skills gap. And so as a reaction, they were thinking about investing some money in open science support. So then we started thinking about how to actually position this role of data stewards within our institution. And here as well, what was really useful is that we could draw inspiration from a couple of Dutch data steward landscape studies that were being done at the time. One of the speakers was talking about this yesterday as well. It was really useful because these studies provided some kind of framework to really think about how to position data stewards within your institution to reflect upon this, to discuss this. So we made very good use of that. And what we came up with is that we wanted to position data stewards again somewhere between the central level and the faculty level. And we also wanted to have them involved in 3 main task areas. So to be a bit more specific, the team itself is based within the Central University Library. There's one coordinator, which is me, and I sort of act like the contact person for the other central services in the institution. And then in addition to me, there are 5 data stewards who are responsible for one of the 5 faculty clusters we have here in Ghent. And so they act as the go-to person for their clusters. And really, the idea is that they develop close ties with the faculties in their respective clusters and become really visible and approachable to their faculties. The team as a whole, as I said, is involved or is responsible for 3 main task areas. First and foremost, we have researcher-facing tasks, so things like raising awareness, informing researchers, training and advising them on everything RDM related, on fair data. Some members of the team are also involved in, I would say, more infrastructure-related projects. So what that means is that they help identify existing or gaps in the existing infrastructure. They spot opportunities for developing new tools, new services. They help to gather user requirements, help with user acceptance testing and that kind of stuff. And then finally, the team also monitors and helps to shape policy and strategy within our institution, but also beyond. Then in terms of recruiting, unfortunately, there is no formal learning for data stewards in Belgium yet. So we couldn't look for people with some kind of certification. But what we did instead was to try to find people with an interesting profile who we could then train on the job. What we were mainly looking for were people with a substantial research experience, because we felt that it was important that they could speak the language of the researcher. And on top of that, who also had a keen interest in RDM and RDM support, of course. We also felt that it was important to have a variety of disciplinary backgrounds in the team and also a variety of different skill sets. And finally, we also looked for other relevant attributes as we could identify them within job ads in other institutions. So things like soft skills, for example, were things that we were really looking for. Once the team was in place, we of course also had to get started. And we did that by developing an initial work plan consisting of 3 phases. First of all, the first couple of weeks or even months, we spent completing a sort of onboarding program, which consisted of self-study, group presentations, group discussions, as well as meetings with key central services staff. And that was really important to sort of all get on the same page and develop a common language. In the next step, we started reaching out to the different faculties to introduce ourselves, get to know the relevant people there, get a feel for how the different faculties worked, how to communicate with them. And then in the last phase, we actually started launching our advisory and training services. Of course, this was to a significant degree disrupted by COVID. In the sense that we weren't able to be as physically present in the different faculties as we had hoped, but we switched all of our services to an online format, and actually that turned out to work pretty well. So in the end, I think COVID didn't hamper us that much. In the meantime, developments were also taking place at the national and regional level in Belgium. First of all, there was a gradual expansion of open science policies to include not only publications, but also research data. I would say that policy today has not yet been completely harmonized across funders and regions, but policies are all moving in the same direction, mainly under the influence of European developments, such as the European Open Science Cloud. And in Flanders, where Ghent University is based, what is really at the moment driving the implementation of research data policies and services within institutions is actually the government, so the Flemish government. More specifically, it approved a policy plan on open science back in 2019. And the most important part in terms of the data stewards is that the government has committed to providing funding to research institutions to support the transition to open science, and that includes dedicated funds to hire and employ data stewards in research institutions, so especially in universities. And that means, of course, that the cohort of data stewards has been increasing in the last year or so. The other coin, or the other side of the coin is, of course, that the government also wants results. And so from this year, we'll start monitoring annual progress in every institution. A number of KPIs have been developed and associated targets that we all will need to achieve. What has also been happening is the emergence of peer networks at the national or regional level. Initially, those networks were mostly policy oriented, but more and more we see what I would call practitioner networks, networks of practitioners, especially in Flanders, networks of data stewards, to facilitate informal exchange of best practices and experiences. Those networks are also involved in organizing some more ad hoc training events. Recently, we did a really great event together with the Fair is Fair project and some EOSC Pillar and EOSC Synergy projects. And to conclude, I think the question is now more and more becoming, how do we further develop the growing community of data stewards? How do we professionalize them? And that brings up a whole set of related questions around competencies, roles of data stewards, coordinated development of training, also the role of disciplinary communities. These are questions I think that have already come up yesterday and that other groups such as the RDA are addressing at the moment as well. So we really hope we can contribute to the discussion and build on the work that many other people are doing at the moment. And I think, yep, that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. That was, again, a wonderful quick overview into all the work that you've been doing in Flanders and at Ghent. And well played around the technical issues. So we do have like, I'll pick out like one or two quick questions, just because I think it would be interesting to the, for everyone to hear the answers, and it actually like might lead nicely into the discussion bit as well to build on there. We have one question around if you have actually developed specific training materials for onboarding all these new data stewards. And there's a question around like how long the funding for these data stewards, these wonderful 5 million, I think it was, are gonna last, and if it's just like for training, or how does it, how much are like institutions required to pay towards this as well to make this a sustainable endeavor?
Yeah, so in terms of the onboarding program, what we did is first of all collect, there's a lot of online training materials on data management that are already out there. So we kind of compiled a program using existing online training and online training materials. We complemented that with some materials that we developed ourselves and that were really sort of more institution specific. So for example, training on what the local storage infrastructure options are. So that those are more things we developed in-house. And then we also invited people from other central services to participate in the training. For example, we had someone from the legal department talk about IP issues and how they relate to data management. We had a session with our data protection officer as well. So we kind of compiled a training program from different sources.
Wonderful.
And then as regards the second question, so we know that the government has committed funding for the until I think 2024, so for the duration of the coalition governments. But it is clear that the targets they have set, they cannot be achieved within that time frame. So the expectation is generally that the funding will become embedded more structurally, and so will continue hopefully beyond that. At the same time, universities are thinking, okay, how can we move from this sort of more project funding approach to a more sustainable model where, I don't know, like a certain amount of grant funding is automatically reserved for supporting data management within institutions. So there are some thoughts about it, but for at least for the next couple of years, funding is secured. And the expectation is that because open science is, especially in a European context, becoming so important, that it will be sustained after that as well.
Yeah, that's a really good insight, and I guess in many cases, the projects like this kick it off, and then once someone has invested some money, other people will follow, or at least are forced to think about it in more detail. So that's a
yeah. I guess it also depends a little bit on whether we can demonstrate that we have a big enough added value. So yeah, the pressure is a little bit on us as well.
I'm sure you can. I'm sure you can. So again, thanks so much, Miriam, for her talk, and also Graham for the really really nice overview and answering all the questions in the chat. I've seen like really long answers popping up, so we'll structure that afterwards into something digestible. I hope so. Thank you very much to our speakers this morning. What's happening now is that we again go into some breakout discussions to go into a bit more in-depth conversations and follow up on some of the questions that have come up, but we also have some a basic structure of things that we thought we could discuss, but as was raised yesterday, like RDMF is really for you, so whatever comes up as a topic within your group, feel free to discuss that. So how it's gonna work is we do have 2 breakout sessions scheduled, and we thought that it would be really good if for those we stay within the same groups. So once you actually get to know each other, you can go into a bit more an in-depth discussion, and you're not like reshuffled and you need to meet new people again. So our dear Alex will put us into, again, 3 groups. As yesterday, you will have DCC colleagues to keep like facilitating the discussion. The coffee break is basically within the breakout. So you'll stay in the breakout rooms and kind of have a break in there. And we will be back in the main room. Now I need to check. So many notes taken at 11:25 British time to do a little bit of reporting back, and then do some closing out panel discussions with another input talk. So if Alex is good to go, we're gonna get pushed into breakout rooms now, and see you there.
So I'll just be helping to sort of chair, facilitate the brief discussion we'll have after the breakout rooms. So I hope I was in breakout, I can't remember what number it was, 6 maybe. So I'll be able to do the rapporteur and the sort of feedback from our session. I hope the 2 other groups have nominated people to speak up on their behalf. So I will start. So I guess seeing as we'd had the 2 sort of breakout rooms, or sorry, 2 breakout sessions really, so the split into 2 by the break, we can just go through each, go through the groups one by one, and we can feedback. So everything we discussed, and I will kick us off with breakout 6. So as I said to my fellow breakout 6 people, if there's anything I miss while I'm speaking here, please pull up your hand, or feel free to type in the chat, or just unmute yourself and speak up if there's anything you think I haven't brought up. So the first question here, the role of data stewards in delivering services. And the question on this was, how in your role do you join up activities in the data lifecycle involving data producers and data centers or other infrastructures? So obviously here we were looking at more so the institutional responses and the various ways that the roles of data stewards and the activities involving data stewards and data centers were approached. So with some really interesting feedback here, there's obviously quite a lot of variety in terms of the institutions. We were looking at Edinburgh Uni, but the research data support team providing a sort of link between the research office at the university, IT services, and running some other in-house services for researchers, being the sort of first point of contact for researchers. And even though there's no sort of like the role wasn't formalized to a huge degree it seemed to work in the current format. There was data stewards sort of all but name, as Kerry brought up, the permanent team members are sort of research data assistants and research data support officers. And at Edinburgh as well, there were the teams involved in delivering sort of RDM training, a lot of outreach services, and just for research staff and students. So we discussed the sort of situations, or the context at Birmingham University, where the library provides support for repository, but the sort of we talked about how they have these what they call the BEAR champions. I can't remember what BEAR acronym stood for, but I'm sure someone will put it in the chat. These are the sort of essentially data champions, RDM champions, coordinated out of the IT services and focusing on different areas, able to give sort of more specific domain and sort of a discipline support to researchers at the university. A few other things to pull out in this discussion. I'm just scrolling down in the notes. Yeah, so I think that a lot of what the discussion we had was about how these different institutions have this role sort of organized or sort of coordinated between different parts of the university, different teams, either IT services or the ethics office and data protection office and that kind of thing. We also discussed how how when we moved on to, so the second question was, in your institutions, how are you involved in the delivery and development of technical services? Again, we sort of kicked off the discussion on the example at Edinburgh, where as the way that the university is set up, we have this sort of information services. So that kind of, in terms of how the different services were sort of funded, there was no competition really between the library and IT services. So these sort of just allowed to sort of are able to pool resources. Just looking at a few other examples of things we discussed here. There was a lot, so there's a lot of discussion of how external services were used, and obviously these wouldn't necessarily have to be sort of funded in different ways, and this is kind of dependent on whether or not the sort of RDM support was based out of the library or IT services or somewhere else at the university. So moving on then to where we were talking, we've kind of moved on to the more general discussions towards a national community of practice for data stewards. And obviously, given the audience we had and the people we have in attendance today, but not necessarily discussing just the national, but the international community of practice for data stewards as well. So the first question here, what gaps can a national level community of practice for data stewards fill? First thing we discussed was having a more sort of standardized approach to minimum basic standards for RDM, not just in institutions or between institutions, but nationally and internationally as well. So the example of people coming from, so even experienced researchers or postdoc researchers or postgrad students or researchers coming from one institution to another, having different, being used to different environments, different setups within their institutions, having to sort of learn the way that their new institution sort of approached the various services and things like that. Having a minimum basic standards for this would definitely help, and this would be something, a role that the community of practice could fill. There's also, we talked about this sort of variation between disciplines in this context as well. So the example was given of, I think it was genomics, where this research community, because it's very sort of more international, there's a lot more standardization between different research groups and institutions, and there tends to be less sort of variation between for example, the genomics community than there would be, say, between other communities when moving between disciplines and institutions. We also discussed the sort of differing interpretations of legal and ethical constraints across national contexts. So just examples of different approaches to GDPR and the anonymization of sensitive data. So we discussed how a community practice would be a good place to sort of for the sharing of sort of best practice guidance for these issues. And yeah, so the harmonization for ethics as well, so the taking into account national laws. And finally, then we're talking about what we can learn from experience in other countries. This is obviously a bit more difficult in the sense that people are going to be necessarily, when people are working these roles, they're going to be focused on their own day-to-day in their own national context as well. But we, again, the sort of the RDA professionalization, that professionalizing, yeah, data stewardship working group and the task forces, these have been set up. And also, we also discussed the sort of the definitions again of the data stewards and the roles and responsibilities, and how these sometimes it's important to sort of keep the boundaries between different competencies and different roles that data stewards would perform in terms of support, and then actually in terms of the more technical working on research projects and helping people out with things like anonymization and that sort of thing. So I hope I haven't given too patchy a summing up of what we discussed in our group. If anyone, again, as I said, if I've missed anything that we discussed in our group, please feel free to add it into the chat, or we can maybe bring it up later. So I'll move on to the next group. So that is the group that was facilitated by Angus. If you had in your group someone who you nominated as a rapporteur.
We didn't actually, but if anyone wants to report back, does anyone from that group want to give some feedback? If not, please fill in any gaps from what I can summarize. We started by responding to Miriam's presentation and asking about the what the next steps are and what additional support can be achieved. And I guess not surprisingly that the need for more funding was one of the main factors there, but also given that funding, how to carve out time for researchers to join in efforts to build services. The European Open Science Cloud, as that's started up, is including the mandated national service providers, and it can be a challenge for institutions to keep track of what's happening there. In Belgium, the support is less mature than in the Netherlands, for example, where there's SURF, as we have JISC here in the UK, and in Switzerland, there was an example of the national strategy being a stimulus for institutions to respond to and to develop their services. With some discussion about UK funders and there's a disconnect between them and the institutional services, not much engagement at all at the service level. So NERC and UKDA being the kind of exemplars for offering support from the data management plan through to the deposition in the archives. There's an interesting example from Elixir of their work to develop the RDM toolkit for life sciences, and some community building around that. So they're looking to develop guidance specific to subdomains and their data types, and developing good practice around that. And so we kind of ended up around this discussion of the balance between disciplinary support and international infrastructures that are developing that, and what can be supported more at national level. And data management plans was one example of that. But I'm not sure we identified other gaps, unless anyone else in the group can remember anything that I've missed. I guess not.
Yeah, I think we're. Thanks, Angus. Thanks for that. So I think, it's Patricia, you were the facilitator for the final group. I don't know if, again, if there was a rapporteur, or if you want to just give us a brief summary of what you guys discussed.
Me, I finally volunteered.
Okay. Oh, very good. 1 for 3. Thanks, Eleanor.
So I think we kind of diverted slightly from the actual questions, but had a good discussion nonetheless. So we started having a conversation less about the role of data stewards in delivering services, and more about how one might measure the success of any services. So, that started from someone kind of asking, how do we measure the success as a data steward, either now or in the future? And then several of us kind of gave examples of how we might already be trying to measure kind of levels of success, which mostly in the discussion we were talking about kind of repositories and trying to measure data reuse and things like that, and the challenges that there are with with trying to measure data reuse, whether that's a good measure. Can you measure things by citations or by downloads? Does any of that actually indicate that the data is being used? There was some suggestion that systems and repositories where users have to register is sometimes more helpful, because you haven't just got the download, you've got kind of registrations, and you can follow up with actual users rather than just kind of downloads in the ether. We did talk about, or there's some kind of on the notes about trying to kind of measure the impact even of data reuse. Obviously, it's great if you can get case studies or kind of impact stories, but getting those from researchers is very difficult, and obviously is kind of an engagement challenge as well. And then I kind of brought up that those sorts of measures for repository reuse and things like that also only measure the potential success of open data, and obviously a lot of RDM and a data steward's role might involve helping to manage data that can't be made open for whatever reason. So how do we kind of measure the success of that? And I just gave a little example from my experience, which is that at the University of Manchester, we use DMP Online for our DMP service. So we're able to get some kind of statistics out of that system about how many data management plans are being created per faculty and school and things like that. So we can kind of look at a level of compliance, but obviously there are the same holes in those sorts of measures as with other measures for kind of repositories and things. And then we started talking about whether any of us were in roles where we supported the kind of in-between stage between the planning and then the kind of depositing data and making it open. So what about the stage that the role might involve to do with kind of managing the live project or live data storage? And we had a few conversations about how it's difficult for people at several institutions to have those connections with potentially IT services that actually manage those kind of storage systems. And yeah, it's kind of a big work in progress, I think, at a lot of places to kind of get those connections and especially as new tools and systems at Manchester, and I think Judith mentioned at Liverpool, we've now got the kind of whole Office 365 suite of tools for storage and collaboration, but we're kind of in the midst of trying to write guidance for researchers on what they can put in those systems. So there's lots of challenges around that side of delivering services within the kind of actual live project stage for researchers. We also talked about that it can be obviously great to have really good, online information on web pages, but we think we've all got experience that even if you've got good online information, researchers still will come to you and ask the same questions that you've got the information for. People don't tend to look at web pages, and so we kind of keen that there is still a need for that kind of human role for a data steward or someone in an RDM role to actually talk to researchers and help them in a more personal way. And in terms of kind of communities of practice, we did talk a little bit about that. So well, firstly, we were talking about what we're all kind of talking about. Oh, there's lots of training for data stewardship potentially out there online, and different groups are kind of creating training materials and things. But how do we as kind of individuals at institutions, if we want to implement data stewardship, how do we find out what training is actually useful? So potentially that's something where a community of practice would be really helpful to kind of gather together what training is out there for data stewards, and then also kind of what's actually useful in what context, I suppose. And then we talked a little bit about the kind of international examples. So in South Africa, there has been for about 10 years a community of practice for digital curation, which was unfunded, but has been useful, I think, but that now the people who initiated that group are retiring and the community is kind of disbanding, and they're not sure how it's going to kind of continue or whether it needs to. So then we were discussing a little bit about how, even if you've set up communities of practice nationally or internationally, how do you keep them going? How do you keep the momentum? If they rely on specific individuals in certain roles, what happens if those people kind of retire or leave or their jobs or move on to something else? Kind of what can we do? How do we fill those gaps? And then just a point from me was that I think that the international groups and communities are really useful for seeing the kind of different models that are working elsewhere. But I think in terms of kind of practical implementation, because the national contexts are so different in terms of kind of what's being funded and government policies and things like that, then sometimes it is useful to also kind of have those national kind of like just national groups as well, so that you can kind of discuss the practicalities of the challenges within your kind of own country due to the kind of funding and policy situation, and what's actually kind of possible at the time. So I think that was kind of everything that we discussed. I'm getting a thumbs up from Patricia, so I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Thank you, Eleanor. Thanks, Angus, as well for your summary too. I'm not seeing any questions or comments in the chat so far, so I hope that's a good sign that people are pretty happy with the summaries that were given for their groups. Thanks everyone for contributing to the in each of your groups. We'll be obviously we'll be taking notes individually for different groups, and we will sort of kind of summarize this and put these together. But I think we're actually bang on time now at the moment, which is really satisfying. I think we're going to move on to a presentation from Helen Clare, who's just turned on her camera. Thanks, Helen. So just a way of introduction, Helen is currently seconded as the Senior E-Infrastructure Strategy Manager for Skills at JISC, and is working on the EOSC Synergy and EOSC Future projects. She leads a task focusing on developing quality guidelines and a train-the-trainer program to support the development of online open science teaching and training. She is JISC's lead on the digital research community, and a founding member of the Open Research Competencies Coalition. She sat on the EOSC Executive Board Skills and Training Working Group in 2020, and is currently chair of the Open Air Community of Practice of training coordinators. And finally, is also on the leadership team for the Reimagining Educational Practices for Open project, the Repo project. So that's a very long-winded introduction, Helen. So thanks for bearing with me. So I'll just leave the floor to you. I can see your slides here perfectly.
Thanks. I did say to Joy she could use a short version. Just to say that my slides are just on the Google Drive if anybody wants to follow along with them. I'm assuming you can all see them okay.
Yep, we can see them fine.
Great. Yeah, I was asked to come along today really to talk about the JISC digital research community, and I assume whether that has any place to support some of the discussions that we've been having here over the last couple of days. So it's been really interesting to hear a lot of the issues, and I think this session will have a focus on the UK. As has already been mentioned, we're quite jealous of some of the activities in other countries, so please do comment and suggest anything that we might take on board. But in addition to the JISC digital research community, when I was approached, I realised another initiative I'm involved in was actually worth talking about as well. So I'm just going to give hopefully a brief overview of these two initiatives, a little bit about the background, how they came around, and see whether there's any scope for carrying on these conversations around data stewardship in the UK within these communities. And I have put on the slide there that these are just two communities, and one of them is technically a coalition. It's kind of just a group of people who got together, but I like to think of it as a community as well. And the other idea, obviously, we know that there are many other communities in the UK alone, looking at areas that we've touched upon over the last few days. So really, I'm just highlighting these two, and then we'll open it for discussion later on. So in terms of the context for these two communities and how they emerged, just a little bit of a trip down memory lane. I'm sure many of you will know, and it's been highlighted, that open access policies have actually been around for a while, and data policies. But really in the UK, there was a certain momentum around 2016 when our main research excellence framework assessment exercise mandated open access policies. So I guess what I'm saying here is that there's a constantly changing policy and research environment, and certainly since 2016 in the UK, we found that there was a lot of roles, new roles being advertised around scholarly communications, around data, and sometimes the language around these roles was confusing because there was no consistency. Nobody was quite sure what these roles were and whether they were actually qualified for them. And indeed, there was a lack of training as well. So it's how do, if you want to move into one of these roles, how do you do that? And it was quite problematic for some institutions because they then had to train staff on the ground, and often those staff became very desirable and would be poached by other institutions. So there's a lot of competition for the right staff. So there's a group of us got together, which I'll talk about in a moment, to sort of think about some of these questions about how can you support these new roles. And I see the data steward as an extension of this kind of conversation. We were talking quite broadly across roles across all the open research spectrum. So how do we scale up these sort of ground level, on the ground training? What skills and competencies are needed? Roles versus competencies. I think this came up in our last discussion. It's easy to talk about what librarians need or what research managers need or what data stewards need. But in reality, in institutions, you've obviously, many times you've got one person with several hats, and it's that different person within different organizations that might have responsibility for different tasks. So how do we deal with that, and how do we provide training and perhaps some kind of more formal structure, accreditation and framework? I just want to mention about communities, and obviously many of you will remember the JISC Open Access Good Practice program, which was a funded program that required some kind of community interaction and sharing, and that was a great way of responding to these mandates. But as I say, that was kind of its time, and we're moving on, and that program no longer exists, and JISC has moved on. We don't support that kind of program anymore, unfortunately, so we have to think about different models. So in terms of the first organisation, we had a bit of an issue around our name, but eventually we came up with the Scholarly Communications Competencies Coalition. So we were formed in 2017 following a conference presentation talking about this shifting sands, as Danny Kingsley, who now works in Australia, presented. The idea of how do we keep up with these research roles, particularly in libraries, who are often at the centre of this. So several of organisations were thinking exactly the same thing, and one person talked to the next, and before we knew it, we had a group of the logos that you can see on the slide there. Essentially, they're most of the organisations who are involved in any kind of training and support for open research across the spectrum. So we've got our research managers, and I know Valerie's on the call. We've had the DCCs, just a very late joiner, just joined us recently, following on from the conversations around this session today. I guess right from the start, just to say, is that we were talking about scholarly communications, but there were some of us, hi Valerie, who were already talking about open research. This needs to be broader than just open research. It's not just about publications, it's about that full spectrum. So we did try to take this on board. So what did we actually do? Well, we spent a lot of time looking at the different frameworks that existed to support scholarly communications and open research roles. We had a look into the backgrounds, again, mainly in libraries, of those people who are coming into the roles, to see where they're coming from. And we noticed a shift, as some have said today, from recruiting from library schools to recruiting researchers. We ran quite a few workshops, again, trying to just get a feel for what the community or the sector out there wanted, looking at trying to map competencies, defining core knowledge and specialist knowledge. And as I say, this was kind of broadly aimed on, around scholarly communication, librarianship. But we had always had an aim to be broader than that. But again, similar to other initiatives, we collected resources. We also had a look at job descriptions and found this inconsistency and lack of standardization across all these roles. But we also, to sort of try and improve with what do these roles actually mean, we encouraged people in the roles to make short videos and share those of what does it actually mean to work in research data management or scholarly communications. We also did some analysis of how much it costs an institution to train their own staff, because we were trying to sort of build a case to have more higher level sort of national initiatives, and we need to justify that. And we wanted to say, it's just because you're doing it in-house, it doesn't mean it's free. It still costs institutions a lot to train their own staff. So could we quantify that in some way? So they're the sort of the initiatives that we try to do. Unfortunately, despite all of those wonderful logos on that slide, we're still kind of like a bottom-up initiative, because it's sort of interested individuals from those organizations that are trying to progress this. So so we didn't manage to get as far as we'd like to go, I guess, is what we wanted to say in terms of progressing this, in terms of getting that recognition for those in these scholarly communications and open research support roles. I was looking for a piece of tumbleweed to illustrate that the group started to sort of flag a little bit anyway, and then COVID came along, but COVID actually looks a little bit like a tumbleweed. So there was a bit of a gap last year, and then this year the SC3 has had a new lease of life, but things have shifted in that last few years. We've seen in the UK certainly a lot of libraries and universities rebranding as open research support rather than just scholarly communications, and becoming broader in terms of the scale of the scope of what they're covering. So we have agreed now to sort of rebrand the Open Research Competencies Coalition to sort of look at this broad range. And it is, I have to say, it is broader in scope than just looking at data stewardship, but that would certainly be part of that broad scope. And what we're trying to do is get funding to sort of to explore the issue a bit more, and really to try to find out what we need to do to progress, because we didn't get anywhere with the previous iteration of SC3. So we want to understand why, and a lot of it comes down to funding. Unfortunately, that's why we're very jealous of those organisations that have government funding. But we also do recognise we need to broaden the conversations. So we've had research software engineers mentioned. In the UK, we're looking to have the Turing Institute, who have a data skills programme as well. So we are aware that there's many other networks that need to be involved in the conversation, and to see what we can do. So what we do want to do now is start with a landscape study of what's going on in the UK in terms of skills, in terms of these different roles, sort of looking at that open science model. So we have to decide which model to use in the first place, and then see, what's out there, which networks are out there, which organisations are out there already looking at this, and can we join it up? And I'm hoping to do that as part of my work on EOSC Synergy, because EOSC Synergy is a regional project in the European Open Science Cloud, and we do have a remit to try and engage the partner countries within EOSC. And I think a lot of the aims are very similar. So I guess we feel like we're back to square one, really, sort of 4 years on from the scholarly communications side of things being the latest role to come along. We're now looking at data stewards and professionalizing those. So we're having this quite broad conversation, and as I say, hopefully that landscape study alongside some more conversations and workshops, we'll get to hear more of your views on what we can actually do. So that's the first initiative. The second one is something that's happened within JISC itself. So I've got my JISC hat on at the moment. This is the JISC Digital Research Community, which was launched in December last year. And the idea with this is to try and bring together all of the people involved in research and who have an interest in that digital aspect of research together for the usual stuff that communities do: sharing, collaborating, supporting each other. But the key here is that it is a cross-discipline and a cross-role. So we want to be inclusive. And so again, by its nature, it's quite a broad community. If you're interested in finding out about it, there's a link on the slide there that has all of our various methods of getting involved. But in terms of how that came about well over a year ago. As JISC, we had a PVCR, Pro Vice Chancellor for Research Strategy Group, that was informing us of our new digital research strategy within JISC. So we led quite a lot of high-level consultation with various funders, national academies and researchers. and other bodies to feed into that. But one of the things that came out of it was that it would be actually quite useful that the types of workshop we were running to inform our strategy, the attendees were finding really useful to be able to talk about those issues with other institutions. So it was suggested that maybe JISC could convene a forum for different roles to actually put together a community. So we started with developing a community council, which again on the previous slide there's a link, and we have quite an impressive range of council members, and they do demonstrate the diversity of the group. So we have learned societies such as the Royal Academy and the Royal Society and the British Academy. We have professors from different disciplines, we have library staff, we have research software engineers involved as well. So that started up, and we spent a lot of time thinking about what we should do. Eventually we launched in December. We had a mailing list launch, and there is a discussion paper which is linked to on the slide there, which kind of summarized all those initial discussions, that if you're interested you can follow that up. But the current status is we have this community now. We have 323 people on the mailing list, and I'm pleased to say it is pretty diverse. It does cover those wide ranges of roles. It's still early days, so we're still getting it going. But we have a separate Teams community for that sort of much more interactive collaboration, rather than just the sort of people who want to just sit back and watch and listen. We started some monthly catch-ups, and we're starting some collaboration cafes shortly. So we're starting to get the community up and running, but as I say, it is still early days. I already mentioned the value, particularly of this network, is that it's for anyone involved in the research process and for bringing those voices together, sort of emphasising that research excellence is promoted through teamwork, which is the message coming through from UKRI at the moment. These are the sort of policies that we did, sort of priorities that we did come up with. These are the top 10, and they're roughly in, well, they are actually in the priority order that the group came up with. So we have skills right at the top. It is very general, but it's there, and a lot of the issues that we've been talking about as part of this data stewardship are there, and it's potentially a forum to discuss these issues across a wide range of different roles. These are the sorts of things, again, that it was thought that the community could do, kind of like the usual community stuff. So we're just getting up and running with that. But as I say, the key point there is that it's that sharing of community across roles. So where does it leave us for this discussion? Certainly in the UK, obviously, I think we know that roles are very diverse. No one institution is like the other. So it does make it difficult to professionalize and to standardize. I've put it will likely continue to be, because I think it's really hard to get universities are just each one is unique. So we have to kind of work with that. But there does certainly seem to be a momentum around trying to recognize various roles supporting research and open research. So we have initiatives such as Hidden Ref, a sort of competition to sort of promote the value of different roles contributing to Ref. We've got Credit, which is again a formal taxonomy for crediting different contributors to research. UKRI's technicians commitment. We've got the Society of Research Software Engineering, which again is a relatively new profession, which has been mentioned a couple of times. And again, this blog post from the new chair of UKRI, again talking about this idea of research as a lone genius. That image isn't helpful, so they're very much behind supporting this recognition of different roles. So that's where I kind of just want to leave you with. That's what we've been doing within JISC and with some other partners. Where should we go next? And do any other countries have comments about where we should go next and what worked for them? We've got the org community and the digital research community. There are also other existing communities, such as there's a quite healthy, strong mailing list that was set up by the DCC and JISC a few years ago. And there is indeed a UK RDA node, which JISC and STFC run. So where should all of these things join up, and how in particular should they support this role of data stewardship?
Thanks, Helen. Thanks. That was really informative, really interesting. So yeah, as you said there, you've kind of left a few questions for us, and encourage people to sort of to speak up here and contribute or ask any questions that they have. I can see here Angus has just put a question in the chat. I'll read it out. So he's just referring back to the role descriptions. So he's asking, do these need to be worked out with the community at national level to respond to different national level policies and infrastructure available?
Yeah, I mean, certainly when we were the SC3 looking specifically just at scholarly communication, we did try to sort of pick apart some of those issues, and it's a complex area. But I think one of the speakers previously from the Netherlands was talking about how they managed to share quite a lot nationally, but there's always that, you know, institutional difference. But I think tying it to the policies is something we're very much trying to do at the moment within ORCC, because I say the lack of funding has been our problem with the lack of progression. So we need to be able to tie it to policies and maybe look at putting in some proposals and to get funding to progress this sort of area. But and I know we certainly have at least 2 other members of ORC on this call. So if any of them want to contribute, please do.
Yeah, please, if anyone wants to make any sort of contribution, and please feel free. I think you should be able to just unmute yourself, or you can put up your hand. Does anyone else have any sort of responses or any other further questions? The floor is open, so please feel free to speak up. Always tell it's approaching lunchtime.
I think for me, what some of these issues that have kind of caused us some problems is that the scope is quite large, certainly within ORG, because we're looking at the whole of open research. So one thing that strikes me about data stewardship is that it is, even though a previous speaker said it's still quite broad, within the scale of, you know, of open research, it is more focused. So to sort of use the momentum around data stewardship that's certainly happening internationally could be something that the UK could use to its advantage. And what I would like to ask is just, what's the next step? I mean, we don't have to think too grandly, I guess. It's just simply what is the next step? What should we do? Should we have a longer session with stakeholders to discuss this, but specifically within the UK?
Anyone fancy taking any sort of response to that, making any sort of response to that question? Doesn't look like it, I'm afraid. As I said, now encouraging people to oh, someone has Fatima, you have your hand up. Oh.
Thank you, Ryan. Helen, I don't think I have an answer for your question. Before you get your hopes up, let me say that. Just from my perspective in South Africa, where we've higher education institutions, universities have just set up their research repositories on Figshare, and we are all sort of individually reaching out to our research communities within our institutions. I think you guys are way ahead, and I think you're doing extremely well. And I think what you're seeing is sort of the stirring up that COVID does. That is what you're seeing, and my advice is to just ride the wave and to not try and pin down everything maybe hard, if that makes sense, but just to take it as it goes, because I think one needs to have this sort of, it's necessary to have this kind of uncertainty during these times, so that when you evolve into something more concrete, it's organic in the solution that you then arrive at, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Fatima. That's really useful reflection, and thank you for letting us know we're doing okay in some areas as well. I mean, I think obviously in the UK we're awaiting some decisions around policy, and our open access policy has been in review for the last couple of years. So we're just waiting for the open access policy, and then the open data policy will be reviewed. So the policy environment's moving quite slowly, I think, but I wonder if we can just explore how we can get something going in parallel with that rather than waiting for the outcome of that. I don't know if the DCC colleagues have anything or to say about your position and what you see from the UK.
I think you mentioned in your slides, Helen, the UK node of the RDA group, and that could be a good thing to develop further to bring together some of these discussions, because I think as you mentioned, the OA policy has been a focus for UKRI, and as things move on, there'll be a need to engage more with the institutions and the funders. So that group could be a focus for more national level discussion to reflect what's happening in the RDA groups as well.
I can certainly find out from colleagues. I think we've got SMSTS. Are you about to say something, Graham?
Yeah, I suppose my thoughts are with regards to the professionalising side of things. And I know from my own background and many of my colleagues in CEDA that we don't come from a traditional sort of research management background. We come from the science background, and we've fallen into kind of research data management. And so to what extent do you think that kind of professionalizing things and having a scheme that you can get an accredited status in, like a chartered data manager, where there is a scheme where there is certain competencies which you have to kind of train to achieve and to show, how much would that be a good way of shoring up the skill basis of the UK community, for example, and how that can help to then formalize and professionalize the whole domain? So I wonder what your thoughts might be on that.
I think that was kind of where we were thinking with the SC3, earlier, that we could try and look at some kind of fairly light touch accreditation, so to be able to say, because I think within recruitment there's just it's quite hard to know what to look for or to prove that you've got the right kind of knowledge. So I mean, maybe some others from other countries can explain whether they're on that route and whether they found that useful. I don't think I had an accreditation mentioned too much, but I mean, within SC3, what we talked about is, the whole, accreditation can be quite intensive in terms of the support that it requires. I mean, there's lots of different models out there, but we were actually just talking about kind of trying to pull together resources and maybe a program for sort of, this is your core knowledge in this particular area. And if it was endorsed by all those organizations on the slide there, then people could at least say, well, I've taken this course, or, without going necessarily to that level of a chartered something, but who's to say that can come in the future? I'm not sure if I answered your question there. I think.
Yeah, I sort of appreciate that the contexts vary enormously, and the skill sets that you need. When you've got a science sort of domain repository, it's very numerical, and there's a lot of data handling and programming involved to some extent as well for kind of the bespoke services. While in other circumstances, the conversation, the approaches will be different, and yeah, how you could formulate an accreditation scheme around the different competencies which would be needed and the different flavors. Maybe it goes back to Angus's point about the national level definition of the different role types, as it were, and the flavors of kind of data managers.
Yeah. So I've just seen a comment in the chat there saying that professionalisation of data stewardship looks like it's taking a path similar to that of RSCs 5 to 6 years ago in the UK. So yeah, it's probably worth looking at the model that they took and how they got where they are. So I mean, certainly it looks like exploring what the UK RDA node could do, and in collaboration with others would be a good first step, even just to have this conversation.
There's also just another comment there in the chat from Alan Morrison about the Elixir Fair Data Stewardship Fellowship training.
Yeah, I mean, this is another angle that's kind of starting to happen anyway, is that, you know, I work for JISC, but I'm actually working on European Open Science Cloud projects, and similarly with many of you at the DCC, you're working on some European projects like FAIR's Fair, and those projects do have remits to try and upskill their partner countries. So you know, I've already talked to, I don't know if Elizabeth Newbold's still on the call, but certainly talked to FAIR's Fair about doing some kind of roadshow in the UK around particularly focusing on that role of data stewardship. So we're thinking about that sort of later on in the year. But that's again, whether we want to do something earlier than that or not, so have more conversations before that.
I just want to see, is anyone, you mentioned about about asking for anyone else who might have experience of the sort of this sort of recognition of our charter of skills, or that kind of thing from outside the UK, if anyone has any sort of a response to that. There's a few comments in the chat. Okay, there's people to finish up.
So I know there's some work going on certification in the Dutch context, but I know that they have standard role definitions for other things, and you know that's a requirement in their system, whereas in the UK things are maybe worked out slightly more organically and by different stakeholders take different approaches to defining these things. But there will also be working in EOSC on certification of training as well, and I think that's something that it would be really good to hear more about as it develops further.
Maybe it's worth mentioning at this point, Angus, that the European Open Science Cloud has 3 task forces related to sort of skills and, well, related to skills. One is specifically around data stewardship, one is around research careers and curricula, and I'm hopefully going to be involved in the upskilling countries task force. And these task forces are actually open for applications from anyone. So if anybody does want to apply from any of the sort of the member countries involved, or observer countries, and we can dig out the link for that.
Yeah, I can. We can dig out the link and put it into the chat there. I'm sure I was looking at it recently enough back into my browser history. I'm not sure if we have any other questions. I'm just conscious of the time. We're sort of due to maybe do a quick bit of a wrap up. But if anyone has any sort of final questions or comments on this section, and if not, we can move on. I think Angus, you'd like to do just a few minutes sort of wrap up at the end of the session today.
Just get those slides up again.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I don't see any more comments or questions. So thanks again, Helen. That was really informative, and thanks everyone for the discussion afterwards as well. And Angus, I will hand over to you to finish up.
So yeah, just a quick reminder about the RDA group on professionalising data stewardship, which Graham mentioned earlier, and has been mentioned a couple of times. So we have the survey coming up soon, and it'd be great to get responses on that, and it has around 20 questions that were, I think, we've pretty well finalised. We're just at that 95% done stage, and that'll be dropping into a mailing list near you soon. So just joining up a few dots across the discussion today, and I think I'm also picking up from yesterday the need to build relationships that join up different data cycles from the data production through to the data centers and what they do to promote reuse has been a focus. Oh gosh, didn't mean to do that. And the need to allow for these relationships to build up and become more trusted, and also for to allow data management plans to evolve and to make use of them as a resource for bringing together service providers and researchers. We heard from Miriam about her work at Ghent to set up the service there, and also regional level, and that message about finding the right level in the institution, which is bound to vary between different institutions, to engage with researchers. Very about the need for more formalised training to help fill the roles, including at postgraduate level, and certification, as we've just been hearing, and with a right balance of skill sets to include soft skills and technical skills. And I guess related to that, work from Elixir and JISC, and there are other examples on developing RDM toolkits and using them as a way to engage specific domains on writing up guidelines to support particular data types and practices. I think we, reflecting the UK situation, there's a feeling of some disengagement of the funding bodies from the institutional support services. Maybe a stronger relationship there with the data centers and also some discussion around how we measure success, how data reuse can really be measured appropriately. Can we look to registration processes and getting people to sign up to services as a way to measure engagement? Can we find DMP metrics that are appropriate for that bit in between the initial data management plan and the submission to the data centers, or indeed the institutional repositories, and how to make use of the connections with the storage and collaboration environments. So we had some discussion around gaps, and I guess just to end up with we obviously have to find the right balance between what disciplines can do best and what's best done at international level and at national level. We recognise that the different contexts need to shape things in some ways, and that the RDA groups have national and regional nodes that can help there. But maybe there's also a place for more guidance on how to set up regional nodes at institutional level, and coordinate that work with the disciplinary infrastructures. So maybe just to end with, it's almost a rhetorical question, but do we need more definition of these roles in the UK at national level? Or is that really best done at international level? So maybe if we could use the response thing in Zoom, you can maybe just give a thumbs up if you think in the UK we need more work at national level. And I can't see the responses, so I'm hoping people are giving thumbs up if they agree with that. If you think it's best done at international level, I think maybe absence of thumbs is a what we're looking for. So let's stop sharing my screen there. I think we're pretty much time for lunch now, and I'd just like to thank our speakers today, and all my DCC colleagues, and particularly Graham for providing the talk this morning at relatively short notice, and everyone who's joined today. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope it was a useful discussion for you. So thanks very much, and have a good lunch.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Angus. So I think there's a social lunch. Patricia, you might be able to fill in on this. So I'm not lost. I have so many screens open. I can't find the agenda.
No great plans. I think that the main option is like that, we keep this room open for another half an hour if people want to stay on, have some chats. If the group is getting too big, we have like the options to break out again into smaller ones, for just so people have the bit more time to process what has happened. I actually got a sandwich delivered, I have to say.